But next, we have the dependency array for useEffect. So if you use useEffect and family, I'll call them, there's a bunch of similar functions in React where you can pass in a dependency array. There's this rule you might see, a warning, if you don't include all the dependencies in the dependency array. What happens, though, if you don't? So this is actually really interesting because many people don't pass in all the dependencies. I see this all the time. I've had many arguments about this. I've talked about this on the podcast a lot. It's very common to use the dependency array for useEffect in React as a conditional. Basically, people put, say, variables in the dependency array with the idea that, only run my effect when these variables change. So you're using the dependency array as a conditional. And that's not what it was designed for. It was designed as performance optimization. And so people will leave out variables that they don't want to trigger it to re-render for. So a lot of times this means functions. So you use state that returns a setter function, and you might use that setter function within your useEffect. And people often don't put this in the dependency array. So what does that mean? What actually happens? Can I find a way to break the system, by not putting everything in the dependency array, or is this perfectly fine behavior? This is what I set out to find out. So I'll keep this one pretty simple, even though I've had entire episodes on this. You can look for that if you want to know more. But basically, I tested this out. So I went in and set up a useEffect, didn't put everything in a dependency array, and you get exactly what you'd expect. When that variable changes, the useEffect doesn't run. It doesn't capture that variable. And what does that mean, though? Maybe that's fine. Maybe you wanted that, right? Let's say you don't pass in a setter or something into that dependency array that you're using in the useEffect. Well, most likely, when you initially write this code, everything's going to work fine. In my experience, this is what I've seen. People write the code, it works fine. Now, where I've seen issues is somebody comes in later and maybe they want to wrap that setter in something that processes the data first. And maybe they're going to pass that into this component as a prop and who knows what, right? But they essentially change that setter function to be something that could be changed throughout the course of your program. Maybe it's a filter. Somebody clicks a button. You didn't have a filter. Now you have a filter. And you're filtering what gets set into some state, whatever it is. So the danger of not putting everything in the dependency array is somebody modifies the code expecting it's going to filter correctly, but because you didn't put it in the dependency array, React doesn't pick up on the fact that the function changed, they changed the function that's being used. Now you're going to have buggy code, and it's going to be pretty subtle and hard to find. So I've helped a couple people now track down this exact bug. I was working with a more junior engineer a couple years ago on a project, and they came to me and they're like, I cannot figure out what's going on. I made this change to this code. All I did was change this one thing, but now this thing, it kind of works, but sometimes it doesn't work. I'm really confused. And I don't see how this one little change I made could just break the program. And I looked at it and I was like, yeah, you're right. This absolutely should not break the program. This, as a programmer, making this change, it should be obvious this just works and there's no problems. So it took hours, but eventually this is what we tracked down the bug to. Somebody didn't put everything in the dependency array. And so we got to this and I was like, I noticed this function that's being derived from this one that's used here is no longer in this dependency array. It's not in the dependency array. I wonder if that's why. And so we added it, And it was funny because, boom, the program worked. At least the initial bug that we were trying to fix was solved, but it added a new bug because the dependency array was being used as a conditional, and now that conditional is being triggered when it shouldn't have been. So this is why I always say, if you're going to specify a dependency array, I usually suggest never specifying one. You don't need to. I'll tell you this. I've broken this rule from pretty much day one in React and always broken it. I have never once yet in all my React programming found a use case where I actually needed to use the dependency array for performance reasons. The way you should do this is not use a dependency array, and then inside your useEffect, you could have a conditional that's like, hey, if this value has changed, then run the body of my useEffect. That's the way I do it. In fact, I even have my own, I call it use conditional effect, which basically extends useEffect. So I can write something that looks like the code that most people write for useEffect, but it actually works correctly. But the very short version of this is, if you use a dependency array, put everything in it. If you don't, you're opening up your program for future bugs that are hard to track down. One of the exact type of bug where it sprouts up a year later after some change, but people don't catch it right away because it only shows up sometimes, and it ends up in the bug tracker as a kind of serious bug, but nobody can figure out where it's coming from, and a couple of people have tried to figure it out, and you've sunk a lot of time into it, and it doesn't get fixed, and just don't do it. If you're going to use a dependency array, put everything in it. Functions, everything. Everything needs to go in it. If you're not going to, I recommend just never using a dependency array. Figure out how to do it without using a dependency array. Now, if you profile your code and you somehow figure out you've run into this case, I've yet to figure out how you even run into it. But if you do, then sure, go ahead, use the dependency array. But only, in my opinion, you should only use it after you've profiled your code and actually found the bottleneck that requires it. I'm not going to belabor this because we got a lot of other fun stuff to talk about. But just keep it simple. You'll get weird behavior, bugs if you don't put everything in a dependency array.